Our link has now been restored to Mumbai in India, as I'm in conversation with the author of the book Indentured, Behind the Scenes at Gupta TV. Rajesh Sundaram was one of the early staffers who was brought in from India to help set up the channel. Mr. Sundaram, I hope that you are back with us, and apologies for that break. The entire ordeal, from what I understand, has not only had a severe impact on your health, but you also believe that it's very important to do this interview. In fact, you have flown from Chennai to Mumbai, I understand, today to talk to us. That's a distance of something like 1,300 kilometers. Why is this so important in the broader context?
Well, it is important, I mean, it has taken a huge toll on my health. I was diabetic when I got into the project, but the sugar levels have been extremely high since I came back. I got my hypertension while I was on that job, and it has led to kidney failure at this time. And I have actually been on dialysis for the last 2 years. I came in, I flew in to Bombay after going to the hospital this morning for dialysis. So yes, this book is very important to me. The story has to be told, because I was drafted into this project without knowing what I was getting into, and I got out of it as soon as I knew that things were terribly, terribly wrong. And and it was not enough for me to just come out of it. I remember a conversation that I had with Mr. Nazim Hoa, where he said that I just needed to take my salary, not listen to what was happening, not see what was happening, and not say whatever I wanted to do. I'm not that kind of an editor. I did not want to continue in that situation just because there was a paycheck at the end of the month. I quit that job. It was a cushy job, and I came out of it. And like I said, it was not enough for me to just come out, but I had to write a book and tell the people of South Africa the intentions behind setting this up, because I believe media is a pillar of democracy. And if you have such an institution in the hands of what I see as the mafia, I thought I had created a monster.
You talk about things being horribly wrong within ANN7. You also say in the book that it was nothing more, and I quote, than a sinister plan to build a propaganda channel. How then did that manifest itself in terms of the propaganda, and who, as you've suggested, was actually micromanaging the process?
Well, from day one, we had Mr. Atul Gupta, who was micromanaging the whole thing, because one thing about him was that he did not trust anybody, especially the professional broadcast experts who had come in. So if he gave him a timeline of say, a month for a particular thing, he'd say, no, I want that in 1 day. And he was a bully there, so most of the people would agree to what he's saying, and it would all end up in a disaster. For instance, when you are setting up a television station, there's a lot of equipment that comes in from different parts of the world, from different vendors. It takes about a month to fix the bugs, if you know what I mean. These systems have to come in sync. They have to talk to each other. There are bugs that keep cropping up for a month, month and a half. Those have to be fixed. There is what is known as a period of dry runs or practice runs, practice bulletins that have to go for a month, month and a half, where these systemic errors are fixed. But we had a situation where there was a tearing hurry that Mr. Gupta had to set up the station.
Let me come right back on you and say, that setting up any business is always going to be in a hurry, given that there are revenue imperatives. I was at the start of this station almost 10 years ago. There were those same pressures to get on air as quickly as possible. What I'm more concerned about when you talk about micromanagement, was there micromanagement in terms of editorial policy? In other words, stories that you could cover, stories that you shouldn't cover, questions that needed to be asked, people who were possibly blacklisted or encouraged to be on the station. Surely that is of more concern than simply rushing to get a station on air.
Well, what my point about rushing a station on air is because they wanted to get the station up as soon as possible, because they knew that the revenues that were promised to them would start coming in, because they had Duduzani Zuma, who was one of the shareholders in this, and they had a commitment from the president to get revenues from the various ministries and departments. That was the reason why they were rushing in. Of course, a station takes some time to set in. There has to be a period of practice runs. That was the point I was making. On the editorial side, yes. Mr. Atul Gupta would sit in on editorial meetings initially. There was Naseem Hoa who would sit in on meetings, and they would dictate the policy. Also, when we had our meetings with President Zuma, 3 of those meetings, he was very clear that he wanted the station to be a station that would be about subtle propaganda, not direct propaganda, but something that would have a bit of credibility. So yes, we would show his rivals. There would be coverage of the rivals, but they would be shown in a negative light. And it would not be direct propaganda. That is the direct instructions from President Zuma. And when we sat in on editorial meetings, we had Naseem Hoa, who would then push in very aggressively with the agenda that was already set. Atul Gupta was also very clear that he wanted to propagate the kind of narrative that he had about the economic policies and the politics of the country. So clearly there was every day, an attempt to get an agenda into this, make this a propaganda station more than anything else.
It's all rather vague, though, Mr. Sundaram. I want you to give me an example of how that might have manifested itself. You talk about subtle propaganda, controlling the narrative. Give me a sense of how that might have been enacted in getting a story or not getting a story to air.
Well, this is something that happened about 4 or 5 years ago. There were clear instructions. There were stories that were shot down. For instance, at that time, I remember there were new political parties that were being set up. So clearly, the signal there was not to cover some of the political parties that were forming at that time.
Political parties, Mr. Sundaram?
On stories about the ANC, a clear line that needed to be followed, that was dictated.
Which political parties, and what was that clear line that needed to be followed?
Well, the line that had to be followed was a pro-Zuma line within the ANC. The clear instructions was that anything that the DA was doing at that time was to be, not given an equal or a balanced coverage. They were supposed to be, looked at in a light that was not very flattering, especially whatever the DA said. When we had editorial meetings where Mr. Naseem Hoa was there, he would be very critical about any journalist who would suggest that they would do a particular angle about, any event concerning the DA. But of course, even within the ANC, the stories that were to be covered had to have a strong Zuma bias towards it, a strong bias towards the ANC.
And is it your contention, Mr. Sundaram, that this was directly related back to the presidency, and either by implication or by direct instruction, it was coming from President Zuma's office or his close confidants?
Go on again.
All right. Once again, I do profusely apologize. We seem to have lost that link again to Mumbai and India. We will try again to re-establish contact in what is a very busy news day, as we also count down the decision by Sean Abrams at the National Prosecuting Authority on whether to prefer charges against former President Jacob Zuma. We are expecting that announcement live on the station at 3:30 this afternoon. We're working on going back to